Hi, I'm Dave Rudden, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Dave Rudden.
author interviews with the very best folks in publishing today. Whether it's indie, traditional publishing, hybrid, no matter what, we talk to them all from all across the spectrum of genre to bring you the very best in the craft of writing. It's because of our great sponsors that we're able to bring you these excellent shows, and I'd like to thank some of those sponsors today. If you would like to sponsor the show, go to hankgarner.com and there's a link in the menu that says advertise. Click on that and you can help sponsor the show as well. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, my very favorite monthly publication. If you want that old pulp magazine feel that you used to get when you were a kid, Tales from the Canyons of the Damned is the book for you. They're up to episode 19 now, the Halloween issue, and you're going to love it. Each month features a different set of writers bringing you the best in weird, pulpy stories. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Go pick it up today. From my friend Nick Breaker, Essence, Book 1, Septima. Nick Breaker is one of the best science fiction writers out there today, and this new series that he's working on is crazy good. It mixes urban fantasy and science fiction and extraterrestrials in a great mix that delivers a story that's adventure with a little steamy and guaranteed to keep you glued to the page. Essence, Book 1, Septima by Nick Breaker. Go pick it up today. ThirdScribe.com is the place to go if you love books, or if you're a writer and want to connect with other writers, or you want to find readers for your books. ThirdScribe.com can help you get started. You can join for free and meet some of your favorite writers, or you can set up a basic author website for free, and then there's multiple levels of help and support that you can get from ThirdScribe.com. I love these guys. I love what they're doing. Go visit ThirdScribe.com today and let Rob and the good folks help you get started. Also, Chronicle World's B-Movie is the latest Future Chronicles edition, book 16 in the Future Chronicles. This book is awesome, and it's been climbing up the charts since it released just this past week. Mummies and giant robots, werewolves and killer koalas, plague creatures and demonic clowns. They're coming, they're hungry, and they're not human intolerant. In this title, in the acclaimed Future Chronicles series of speculative fiction anthologies created by award-winning author Samuel Peralta, the destination is the B-Movie, the realm of the outlandish and the macabre, the strange and the unexpected. Go pick up B-Movie, Chronicle Worlds today. Thanks to all our sponsors. At the end of the show, as always, we're going to have a audio clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
Hey everybody, it's Josh Hayes, and I'm here with Chuck Manley and Scott Moon. We are Keystroke Medium, and this is the Keystroke Medium Minute.
Hi, I'm Chuck Manley. I'm here with Josh Hayes and Scott Moon. We're all from Keystroke Medium, and this is a Keystroke Medium Minute. We're going to be discussing making the most of your writing time. And Josh, I'm going to toss this one to you to get us started.
I will catch it right here. I think some of the stuff that I have learned over the last couple of years, while I'm looking at making this a serious full-time career, is that you look at everything that it entails being an indie writer, and you look at, well, it's the writing, it's the editing, it's the formatting, it's figuring out what you're going to do publishing-wise. It's, are you going to be KU? Are you not going to be KU? Is this the cover you want? Is this not the cover you want? Well, one of the cool things about being an indie writer is that you have control over everything. That's also, I think, one of the very real hang-ups on being an indie writer, especially for me, because I will spend a lot of time writing, but I also like kind of dabbling in book covers. And so I will go through stock photo sites and scroll through stock photo sites until I find a photo I like. Well, sometimes it takes me 3 hours to find a photo I like, and the whole 3 hours I've been just sitting there scrolling through a photo stock site, go, oh, it's a nice one. Oh, that's a nice one. Oh, that's a nice one. And then you have to sit back and kind of think, was those 3 hours, did that benefit me at all when I could have been writing? And so I think you need to kind of look at those things and say, what am I doing with my time, and is it benefiting me in my writing career?
Yep. We've talked about this a lot on a one-to-one and on the show also. And that's the thing, is these things we're talking about here specifically is things that feel like they're productive, but they're actually not. It's be better to outsource cover design and some marketing things and stuff most of the time. My personal, what would you call it, kryptonite or whatever, is like formatting my book. So I'll get in there and I'll decide that I'm going to write today in Scrivener. And then tomorrow's like, well, I really want to write on Google Docs. And so I'll transport everything over there and get it all formatted, and spent 4 hours of writing time where I'm being productive, but really I didn't do anything. And so you got to just stay focused.
Yeah, and also even within the act of producing a manuscript, in the act of writing itself, you can find things that you get lost on. If if you're always going back trying to correct things in your manuscript, that's not a good use of your time if you're trying to get a first draft finished. And, a lot of times you think, oh, I've got this great idea for a new book. And instead of working on the book that you have in front of you, you spend time outlining a book that you might maybe get to write at some point in the future, when you really should be focused on what you've already started. So it's really, like Josh said, both of you said, it's just a matter of making sure that the time you're spending at the keyboard is moving you forward in your career and getting you to a finished product for your readers. And then you can move on to that other stuff, or make whatever it is you've been working on more perfect. So it's really about focus and forward momentum, I think, in a lot of ways.
All of those things are very seductive, especially I got a great idea for a new story. I'll just step aside for a minute and do that, like you said, Chuck. But it's very seductive, and it can derail you quite a bit. Absolutely.
Yep. I think definitely if you're just starting out and you're new to this game of indie or hybrid or whatever type of writing you choose. Well, we're indie writers, but we've talked with traditional writers and hybrids, and I think when you're first starting out, the writing is the most important part. If you don't have the writing done, if you don't have the story done, if you don't have the product to slap a cover on, a nice cover isn't going to do you any good. Or knowing where you're going to publish it, that's not going to do you any good if you don't have the book done. So I think definitely when you're first starting out, the writing is what matters most. Okay, well, this has been Josh for Chuck and Scott. Thanks for listening to this Keystroke Minute. You can find more of our show at keystrokemedium.com, where we have author interviews and craft discussion and a lot of shenanigans. Come out and hang out with us.
Shenanigans.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Dave Rudden on the show with me. Dave is the author of fantastical stories, sometimes for younger readers, and I'm really excited to get his ideas on the art of storytelling. So welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm happy to have you, Dave. Like we were saying just before we started recording, I just finished recording with Joe Abercrombie. This is Halloween night that we're recording, and this seems to be the day for recording with folks in the UK. Who would have figured?
You'd be out doing scary stuff, but apparently, we're all at home.
Every author that I've called in the UK today was recording podcasts, not scaring little kids. So I'm a little I'm a little disappointed in the ideas that I had about you guys over there.
We must try harder.
You must try.
I'll lean out the window halfway through and just yell at somebody.
Right. Well, you have a reputation to live up to. But anyway. Well, look, before we can get into anything, we start the show with the same question every time, and that question is: what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
It's a big question. I mean, I know I always loved reading from a very young age. I come from a village of 350 people in rural Ireland, so there was nothing else to do but read. And I would have been a very shy kid, and as I got older, I would have been like, when things get into difficult teenage years, I was picked on quite a lot. So like books were always a refuge, but I never thought I could write them. I always thought that like to be a writer, you had to be, posh or English or dead. And these books were just these magical things that arrived fully formed. I did always love stories, though. I think my earliest memory of coming up with stories myself was I was an avid player of video games. I grew up on Super Nintendo and Mario, and I thought it was completely normal to have written out backstories for all of the enemies in Mario, like the turtles and the mushrooms and things. I was like, oh, well, that's this and that's this. And then when I found out there were actual backstories for them, I was really upset. It's like, no, I know these people. I spent a lot of time with them. I used to create backstories and drafts, and but I never considered it writing. It was just, I was playing. I was just having fun with it. So it was only really in my early 20s when I got to college that I met other people who were trying to be writers. And they were like, oh, do you make up stuff as well? And I was like, yeah. And well, that's writing. You just write them down and try and sell them. And I was like, all right. So I feel like I've been a storyteller for years, but it was years before I realized I could make that into writing.
Right. You said you grew up in a village in Ireland. I never would have guessed you were Irish.
Will people see the picture of me? I've got like a giant red beard and red hair. Like I look like Conor McGregor let himself go, basically. So,
so if we open the dictionary to Irish, it's you just right there.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I don't wear green because I look like the flag. So.
I start with that question for several reasons, but you know what that question always does is it seems to put people kind of in a mind to really revisit that time when storytelling was innocent and before there was stuff attached to it, before it was a career, before it was a hobby that had to be taken seriously, back when we told stories because it was in our nature to do so. And you said that you had this idea of books that just came fully formed and just out of the ether, and there are books, and you don't realize that there's a person behind them, and there's a craft and an art to it, and all of that stuff, which kind of reinforces my theory that I have that storytellers are born and then writers are made. That you're born with the gene to live in fantasy worlds and to come up with these yarns, and then you take that thing and you actually work it into a skill, and then you become a writer. At what point, you said you were in college when that kind of dawned on you that you could then take that into a marketable skill?
Yeah, I mean, I met what I would consider, I guess, journeyman writers, like people who weren't like OBEs or hadn't a million awards or weren't like Neil Gaiman or Terry Pratchett. They were other people who were definitely better than I was and much more accomplished, but hadn't had books out or were still working on their craft. And they began to I began to draw a line, I guess, between myself and what I considered actual authors. It's like, oh, there's an intermediate stage. And I think you've latched onto something really interesting there, where I do think, like I teach a lot of writing classes, and depending on the age that I'm talking to, with kids, I say that it's anyone can make themselves a writer, because any kid can be a writer. It's a really funny and sad thing that if you tell a bunch of 10-year-olds, if you tell a bunch of 15-year-olds you can be a writer, they all kind of look at the floor and scuff their toes and things like that. Whereas if you tell a bunch of 10-year-olds they can be authors, they go, I know, I've already written a book. Like, what are you talking about? I'm going to be an astronaut next. And I think it's something to do with what we call it secondary school here, or maybe high school or middle school in the States, where everything becomes a little bit more along certain lines. I think creativity can often be quashed in favor of obedience or in favor of conformity. And it's an odd one. I do think, for me, I think storytelling is a bit like singing, in that you can learn techniques and you can polish what's already there, but you need to have pitch. You need to have an ear for the way a story should go. And that can be, that has to be trained up. But I think there are people who have more of an aptitude than others. Like I always think a lot of writing is a process, and a lot of writing is just shoveling fuel and putting it into the furnace. But some days it's wet coal, and other days it's plutonium, basically. And for some people, it's just like there are books I've read where I cannot believe they're using the same 26 letters as I am, and I don't know how much of that is talent or the particular things they've gone through in their life or training. And yeah, it's a really, I think it's different for everybody, basically.
Dave, before we get too far ahead, what sorts of stories did you love when you were a youngster?
So I was always mad about fantasy. Like one of the things about Ireland is we're very into our mythology, and we're very into our not exactly superstitions, but like Irish people are this weird mix of everybody knows at least 8 sort of folk tales about their area. Like where I'm from, Bonboy, there's like an old ring fort from like the Stone Age, which everyone just kind of like nods at as like we call it the fairy fort. And like it's not that we believe in fairies, but it's like no, that's what that is. And like we have this very sort of like deep, and I don't want to sound twee, but sort of a mystical connection to our past type thing. Yeah. But so I was always, my first superheroes and my first fantasy stories were myths and legends, and I found them so fascinating. And then I moved into reading like high fantasy, and I read a lot of urban fantasy. And as somebody who was very shy, fantasy made sense to me in a way that the real world didn't. Like in fantasy stories, if you were good and you were kind, you get hassle or whatever, but it would work out. Like there was a certain sort of equation to these things, like, you know, doing the right thing paid off, basically. And that was something that I was, especially in my teenage years, I didn't actually, like, there's a great line from a Sarah Maria Griffin essay where she talks about video games. And she says, when you're nice to someone in a video game, they're nice to you. That's how video games work. That's not how life works. And I was really drawn to these worlds, like I read a lot of like tie-in fiction, like the Forgotten Realms stuff, things where there's like mages and warriors and thieves, and I loved that. I was like, oh, you can just pick a career, and there's like 8 of them, and it's grand. So that was what I loved. And then when I got a little bit older, I think it was 12 or 13, the author that I came across that changed not just my interest in reading, but possibly my entire worldview was Terry Pratchett. I kind of stumbled into the Discworld, and which are far more chaotic than your general fantasy novel. But there was something about the way that he spoke, not just directly to me, directly to the reader. One of the things I love about him is that like he breaks every single rule you're told. It's like, you know, don't skip around between different POVs. You know, don't directly address the reader. You know, use chapters. And he was like, nope. And that was sort of. Discworld for me is home, really. Like that, I was so entranced by his wit and his style. So like pretty much read like anything fantasy got my hands on. My true love was Discworld.
I'm laughing because I had the same experience. Like I think when you discover Pratchett, you either get it or you don't. And I think if you meet someone that doesn't like Terry Pratchett, you can watch them try to read a Discworld book, and they're just frustrated. They just don't get it. But if you're one of those people that does get it, you're like, oh, these are my people. Like I completely, you know, it matches the chaos in our own brain sometimes, you know, and it feels like home.
It really does, and I don't think it's just fantasy fans. I have one of my housemates has no interest in fantasy whatsoever, but I gave her a Terry Pratchett book. I gave her Weird Sisters, and she came back and she was like, and she has no emotions about anything, but she was like, that was good. And I was like, really? And she's like, no, because they're not fantasy books. They're technically satire. They're a comment on this world. And I think the people who've told me that they don't like them, like, oh, he's too madcap, and it's like, no, but there's a really specific aim in every single thing that it takes a lot of skill to be that all over the place and still bring it back to one single line or one single moment. Like there's always a plan in whatever he's doing. I think people write it off too quickly because they are silly. Like the jokes are the jokes are so stupid at times, but that's kind of the joy of it. Like, he sucker punches you with like real truth amid absolute nonsense.
Right, and there tend to be multiple layers of what's going on, and it's sometimes it's silly on the surface, but it's for a reason. There's a deeper thing going on there.
Yeah, I mean, like, silly is the delivery system, and I think you kind of need that. And I, as someone who writes for young people and for kids, I get asked a lot about whether there's a moral to my work, or whether there's some kind of like deep underlying lesson. And I guess there can be, or there's start preaching is a second. Learn how to tell a story first, moral threaded through it, or have the character act out. You can't just preach. You have to have some sort of like casing for it.
One thing I love to ask my my friends in England, Ireland, Europe, is that because I am American and I grew up with a very typical American upbringing, compared to you guys, we are a very young culture, but what comes with that is a lack of a sense of deep history and roots. When we think of something as ancient, we're talking about 200 years. When you guys talk about something ancient, you're talking about, thousands of years. And, so, a lot of us Americans have a very romantic view of Ireland and England and Europe and kind of this, we think of it in like high fantasy terms, that there's this magical place across the water where they have a long, deep history and like you talk about with the fairy ring there, that, there probably is magic there, and it's just buried just under the surface. And if I went to England, I think I could, I could find the magic again. We romanticize it like that. I love to hear that, in Ireland, in your experience, that you guys do hold some of those traditions and folklore, kind of close to you and embrace that. And like you said, not that you necessarily believe that fairies are living there, but you have a respect and you kind of honor those folk tales and those traditions. How does that, I'm also fascinated in how place affects someone's storytelling and how much you are influenced by the place that you're from. If you, and I know this is a hypothetical and this is unfair of me to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you feel like if you were from anywhere else that you could tell the kinds of stories that you tell?
I don't know if I could. I think that like everything in my series Knights of the Borrowed Dark is so attuned to who I am and my views on fantasy and my views on character and personality that like I don't think it was the very first novel I wrote in my own voice. That was a really interesting thing. I wrote it. I started writing it as part of NaNoWriMo. I started November 1st, 2012, also because it was a homework assignment to my creative writing masters. And I had tried writing in other people's voices before. I was a Neil Gaiman cover band for years. Oh. It wasn't really working for me, as I think everybody is at some point. Excuse me. But when I sat down to write Knights of the Borrowed Dark for the first time in my life, I was like, I'm just going to write this the way that I talk. And my background, I think this ties back to Irish things. Like, there's a huge tradition in Ireland of storytelling, like oral storytelling. Like, we used to have traveling performers who would go between different castles and forts and sing and speak for their basically. And I know in America you have that with spoken word. The spoken word scene in America is incredible and like much more developed than ours. But we have this old sort of like, it's a really common thing at like family parties for someone to stand up and do a recitation. And I found this really fascinating when I was a kid because my whole family, like I'm the only writer in my family, like my family are teachers and some work from home and things like that. But it was maybe a Christmas party or something when I was 8, and my uncle Hugh just stood up and delivered like an 8-minute like recitation poem. And I was like, what? How'd you do that? And he's like, oh, well, it's just my recitation. It's my thing that I do. And I was like, does everybody have one? And everybody did. And it was really confusing. And so we do have this tradition, and like for me with Knights of the Borrowed Dark, so I'm from 4 miles below the Northern Irish border, and especially in Ulster, the province where I'm from, we do have a real tie to history here, and we've just so much of it. Like there's a pub down the road from where I live that's been open for 800 years. Like it's ludicrous. Yeah, probably not the same manager, but like it's and like I assume that he's very wizened. But so it's only for me writing the first draft of Knights of the Borrowed Dark. I didn't necessarily think about where a lot of the ideas were coming from. Like I started writing the first draft. I treat first drafts very much as a space to play in, and a space to get things wrong in, so I can realize what the story needs. I think if you write the first draft, the book doesn't stops being an amorphous blob of nothing and starts becoming an equation where certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And it's only years later when I do interviews about it and I talk about it that people say, well, why did you choose this? And why did you choose this? And I have to sort of reverse engineer it and look back, because at the time it felt right. It felt like the right choice. And now I look back and I go, well, my books are about creatures who cross a border into another world, and you start off believing that they're evil, and then you realize there's more complexity to it than that. And it's sort of, I look back and I say, well, that's kind of natural that I would have chosen, this idea of things living on the edge and where things begin and where things end, and what it's like to be a part of two worlds, and what it's like to be raised to mistrust other things that you don't understand, who have a similar history to you but on the other side of a divide. And that all sounds really clever because I've had a couple of years to think about it. At the time, I remember we used to, like, my gran lives on the other side of the border, and so we would back up until maybe 1992 or so, there were forts and there were armed guard, and you would drive up to the border, and the British soldiers would like look in and they'd be holding their machine guns and be like, all right, carry on. And that to us was very, very normal until they were dismantled. And I guess it had an effect. I guess it crawled in there and took root. So it does, place to me is very important. On a really basic level, my main character, Denizen, grows up on Achill Island, which is this island off the west coast of Ireland. And it's this gorgeous, barren, heather brambled, really desolate sort of like coastal landscape. And I had to set the start of the book there. We used to go there on our holidays every year, and there's nothing to do there but stare at the sea and imagine things coming out of it. So for me, it was a completely natural choice to put the book there. And then Denizen moves to Dublin, to our capital, and that for him is the start of this brand new life, because when I was 17, I started college, and I went from a village of 350 people to a city of 1 million people, and I am never, ever going back. And it felt really natural to give Denizen that journey as well. Like, what could be bigger for someone from the country to move to a city, to move to the city in Ireland, So a lot of it just felt bone deep and right for me, basically.
So when you went to college at 17, what did you think you were going for?
It was less going for and more running away from. I wanted to go to Dublin. I wanted to go to a city to get out of where I was. I studied English and history because my dad's a teacher, and I was like, I guess I'll be a teacher. I know I like English. And when I got to college, it was the first time in my life I had a proper internet connection. So I discovered Fanfiction. And I fell into this forum that wrote Warhammer 40k fanfiction.
Love it.
To anyone who's not, to anyone who isn't familiar with that, it's the tie-in fiction for those little models you paint, tabletop gaming, basically. And I loved it. And also it was written by people who weren't published authors. Some of it was good, some of it was bad. And that to me was delightful, because I was like, oh, I'm really bad at writing. This is good. That means other people are as well, and other people are trying. And I remember posting a story on this forum, and I got some good feedback and I got some critical feedback, and somebody left a comment, really enjoyed it, when's the next one? And I was like, when's the next one? Right. And so I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and kind of phoned in my degree after that, to be honest, because I was too busy, arguing about semicolons on this forum with other people, and like talking about how you develop characters and giving people feedback and getting feedback. And it was amazing. I mean, I think one of the great things I personally really like fan fiction. I love the fact that when you're starting off writing, you are trying to teach yourself sentence structure and character development and plot and description and all these things. It's a lot to try and learn at once. And what fan fiction does is it allows you to use the furniture someone else has left behind. So you don't have to spend, hours trying to make up factions. You can use different things. I mean, I would always tell fan fiction writers, if you want to be a published author, at some point you have to move to your own stuff. But as a starting ground and as a playground, it's really useful. What broke me out of doing fan fiction, like some 200,000 words later, was I was writing a story. It was like the 8th or 9th part of this character I've been working with. I think I was 80,000 words in total deep into this character, and my laptop died, and I lost it all. And I think writing so often is about how you characterize failure, because failure is an inherent part of the job, whether it's failing to get something published or getting a rejection from an agent or just not knowing what word to put next. And that moment when my laptop died, I was like, this is a sign. I'm going to characterize this as a sign as opposed to a massive mistake. And I just have to move on and stop doing fan fiction. And I moved away from the forum and I joined DeviantArt, which is sort of a precursor to Wattpad. And I started writing original work on that and entering competitions. And I think in my head, I was like, I have to make a go of it now. I can't let those 80,000 words stop me writing. I have to sort of prove myself by writing another 80,000 words that I don't accidentally lose and that I do back up on Dropbox. And I began writing short stories. I worked my way up. I always think writing is a muscle. So I worked my way up from very, very short stories to longer form short stories. And I also I was a very shy teenager. And when I got to college, I discovered acting. And I realized, you can just pretend to be confident. And if you're good enough at that, no one will know you're lying. So
look, I've been doing that for over 250 episodes on this podcast.
You do an excellent job, but you were I've listened to a few episodes. You seem you really know what you're doing. But yeah. So that the acting really filters into the writing for me, because I acted in college in drama societies, and then I taught for a couple of years afterwards. And acting and teaching and writing are the same. You are telling a story, you are looking at an audience, you are hoping they care. It is up to you to make them care, and you also have about 10 seconds whether they're going to stop. So I went back to the school that I had went to as a teenager 3 years after leaving, and 3 years after being the most, it was a very small, so I went back to the school that I went to and that I had a really, really bad experience in, and I went back 3 years after I'd left. So the kids who were in second year when I left were now in sixth year. And so the memories of what I had gone through were pretty much very fresh for everybody. And on my first day, one of the kids was like, sir, I know your first name. And I just said, do you know what will happen if you use it? And they all went back in their seats. And I was like, oh, things are very different now. This is good. And that's been my writing style since. When you walk out in front of an audience, when you walk out in front of a class, when you write the first line of a book, that's all you get. The audience's attention or the reader's attention is a gift. And if you squander it, they'll leave. So when I write, I read out all my stuff aloud. I winch every sentence really, really tight to make sure that there's no wasted word or no opportunity for the writer or for the reader to walk away from it. I have no idea what the original question was.
Well, no, who cares? That was brilliant. I love the idea of that the reader has given you their trust, and with every sentence you have to earn and keep that trust. I love that way of thinking about it. That's great.
You just make it worth it for them, and then you get them back.
Right. One thing I find interesting about your story, Dave, is that since the internet has become such a part of our lives, we now have writers like you that really have kind of come into their own writing in public, so to speak. So you've got the forums where you're writing Warhammer, fan fiction, and then, over to Wattpad. And as you're writing and you're learning and you're, building those muscles, you're putting it out there for other people to, give their opinions and to give their feedback and things like that. I wonder what that, having that instant feedback, I wonder if that is helping us mature as writers, more quickly than, in the past, where someone may toil over a manuscript all on their own in their room for years, and then you send it to an agent and they give some feedback. And, it seems like the internet has allowed us to, it definitely has allowed us to collaborate more closely and more quickly. But I wonder what that's doing for our collective writing skill.
Yeah, I mean, I heard, I read a tweet earlier that compared Facebook to the printing press as an innovation that's going to change fundamentally the written word and the read word. And I don't know where I fall on that, but the internet is changing everything. I know from publisher friends that there's started to become a lot more of the submissions they get are very pitch based. Like less and less they're about the prose and more that, like, I have a really good hook. And that's because on Twitter you have things like pitch wars and there's this move towards almost the screenwriting idea of just like, give it to me in a sentence. And I think that's interesting. I don't know how long that will last. I know for me, my feedback came first on the internet from strangers, and then standing in a pub with a microphone, hoping to make like 40 slightly rowdy people like you, and then trying to make teenagers like you, which is much scarier. I think writers, the future of writing is that we all have to become cross-platform. Like, I do feel bad for... Writing isn't necessarily a performance art. Like, some people gravitate towards writing because you can spend all of your time in a dark room choosing very carefully what word follows the other. However, as somebody who really enjoys performing, and I've done something like 287 school and library events since book one came out last year. I don't sleep. Yeah, I really enjoy that. I'm used to that being in front of people, and that's an advantage. And whenever an opportunity to get my work out a different way comes up, I take it. I actually, when you were saying about writing in public, one of the gigs I did recently was a Canadian choir had come to Ireland and wanted a writer to write things in real time that a choir would then sing in public, which was so terrifying, but also a lot of fun. So I would just write like observations or things I was afraid of, and they would stream to them and they would sing it in public. I wasn't allowed to swear. It was very important.
Oh my God.
That to me is really, it was nerve-wracking, but like, I believe work is written to be shared. I think well, it depends. If you want to write purely for yourself, that's totally fine. But I write for an audience. I write, every time I put down a word, I don't ask myself whether that's the right word for me. I ask myself, is that the word that will get across when I'm saying to other people? I have this almost pathological need to like share my work, because I would have like, because I was a shy kid and I played movies in my head and I told stories to myself to keep myself busy and happy. And now I want to see whether other people like them. It's a tough one. The internet makes that really easy, but also you have to be very careful of like Twitter is an echo chamber, and you can put up stuff and have it reach a certain amount of people and no one at all. And putting stuff online, I know in particular, I stopped using Wattpad because I had a short story up there, and I submitted it to a competition, and they were like, "This is already published online. We won't take it." And that, like, I was kind of like, right, I'm going to have to take my stuff offline and join writing groups and things like that, because I think Wattpad and things that are great when you're just starting off, but like at some point you do have to leave those things behind, because they're up there for free. No one's going to pay for them, which means you're not going to get paid, which means you're not going to be able to live, basically. Like, and I feel bad reducing it to monetary terms, but like, people need to eat. So,
Right.
yeah.
You said earlier that Knights of the Borrowed Dark began as a writing assignment in school, in college.
Yeah, so I had taught for a couple of years, from 20 till 22, and then I was writing. I was writing a lot. I was sending a lot of stuff out, and I was joining writing groups. I was doing a lot of performance, and I began to. My issue was I was only writing when it was easy. Which meant I was writing about every 6 weeks. So I sort of decided that, like, it was. I devoted enough time to it at this point that it was time to go big or go home. So I applied for the Creative Writing Masters in University College Dublin to see whether I would get in, basically, because, you know, submit 25 pages of material, they make their choice. I was like, I think I might have something here. I think I might have something to say, and I think I might have the means to say it, but I don't know. So I'll let these people tell me. And yeah, so I sent it in, and I think it's important to point out that university here is a lot cheaper than in the States. I think it's about $6,000 to do a master's here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which there was a guy in my master's from Ohio, and I was like, "Why did you choose here?" And he was like, "Well, I'm Irish American, and I wanted to know what that meant. Also, it would have cost me $40,000." And I was like, I see. Makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, and we get a lot of American students over here. So if any of your listeners are considering coming over, you absolutely should. So I applied, I got in, and one of our first assignments was to write the first chapter of a novel. And I had never considered writing a novel. It was something I thought I would attempt. I was 25. I thought, I'm too young. I don't have an idea that I could sustain over 70,000 words. I don't want to get it wrong. And they were like, well, you have to write it or you don't get any marks. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I started writing, and I wrote the first chapter of Knights of the Borrowed Dark. And I really liked it. I brought it in. They hated it. I brought it in, and they were like, this is too dark, and it's too weird, and it's really upsetting, and kids will hate this, and you're wrong. And I was like, well, listen, I'm going to keep going. So there was 12 people in my master's. Not one of them was into fantasy. So every time I brought in a story, they'd be like, oh, is he a werewolf? No. Are they all werewolves? Maybe. Leave me like, I'm a big fan of, I hate the phrase literary fiction, because all genres are literary and labels are for jam makers, but like, it annoys me, the snobbery that people level against genre fiction, as if it was more difficult to set a story in this world that exists than it is to make up an entire world. Like, book 3 in my trilogy, The Endless King, is set in a different city than Dublin, and it's so much more challenging when you can't walk out and look at the geography, when you have to keep an entire moving map of a city in your head. I honestly think, I think that, like, it's so much more challenging to write fantasy or to create entire worlds and entire magical systems that have to make sense. I'm very into, like, it sounds weird to talk about realism when you're talking about writing magic, but plausibility. Like, people understand systems, and they can pick out when something is just thrown in because it sounds cool. And I think I always try and achieve narrative unity in my work, where every single facet of the world and every single monster and every single like flair of the magic tells you something about the character. But anyway, yes. So did the masters and continued writing Knights of the Borrowed Dark, and I used it as my thesis at the end. And my lecturer took me aside, and he was like, I think you might have something here. Like, I think you should finish this. I think it could go somewhere. and he gave me a really brilliant piece of advice where I was like, oh, I might try and find an Irish publisher. And Ireland is small, and our publishers are well renowned but small. And he said, no, start at the top and work your way down. All they can say is no. If you're genuine, think you have something here, why not get turned down by the best agent in London? Because the second best might say yes. So it was really, really good advice. And I think you should be realistic about your ability and what and put as much work as you possibly can in. But why not aim as high as you can? I think the big problem with being a writer is you need to have, on one side, massive arrogance to think that you have a story worth telling and that people should listen. But on the other side, you need to have a massive amount of self-doubt so you can edit that story and make it good. So you're sort of seesawing all the time. But yeah, I sent it out, and I got 25 no's from 25 different agents. And then finally, an agent picked it up and sent it to Puffin, and it sold in 13 days. And I've been running like a mad thing ever since.
Wow. This book is, and because of marketing, we're forced to put labels and to place things at certain places on the shelves and things like that. And I like what you said about labels earlier. But because booksellers need to sell books and they need to put them in a particular place, this book gets labeled for younger readers, although that's such a misnomer. Did you set out that the book you were writing was going to be geared toward a younger audience? Did that factor in at all, or is that just the shape that this particular story took?
I think it's a mixture. I mean, I am a giant 12-year-old. I think there's no point in lying to you now. You've been talking to me for half an hour. You can kind of tell. And I also think that your teenage years, or the years from, we'll say, 11 to 12 up, are so fascinating because adults know the shape that they are, and they have a wealth of experience behind them. And when you're a kid, I always think kids are adults, but just without the benefit and shield of experience. Like, you feel things so strongly when you're a teenager because you've never felt them before. Like the first time you learn that you can't necessarily trust adults in certain small ways. The first time you find that you've been lied to by a parent. The first time you have to have a job. The first time you fall in love, your first kiss. These are all so... I hate when people call teenagers immature, because it's like, you know, you get into your 20s or your 30s and you've built up a certain amount of armor. You realize you're not going to die when someone breaks up with you because you've been broken up with before. Whereas as a teenager, you don't know that. Like, everything is, you are always the oldest you've ever been until now. And it's an immensely stressful and amazing and awful time. And I immediately gravitated towards that because I wanted to write about somebody being thrown into a brand new world of being a teenager, but also magic, basically, but incredibly stressful magic, because I was the kind of kid who, half of me wanted magical powers, the other half of me knew I'd be terrible at them. Like, I don't even like sports. I was always a questioning kid. I was always a difficult child and teenager, and I wanted to sort of reflect that. My main character, Denizen, suffers from an awful lot of anxiety and the uncontrollable ability to question things. He's always looking for angles. And I think, coming back to that thing we talked about with Irish people having this air of sort of mysticism about them, is that on one side we have that, and we have this big heritage, and we know a lot about the folklore tied into our area. On the other side of things, we're immensely difficult to please. So in, like, you read English stories about kids discovering magic, and it's like, you know, oh my lord, magic. And whereas in Irish stuff, they'd be like, what? What is this? This sounds awful. Leave me alone. Like, we're really, we're a tough nut to crack. I mean, as if Freud said that, like, the Irish people are immune to psychology. Like, we're awkward and we're difficult and we're mouthy, and I wanted to see that. I wanted to write that. So it started off, it was always going to be a book for young people. On the other side, I didn't want to compromise. and I don't feel I have compromised on the darker nature of the monsters and the darker nature of loss in the book. The books are very much about grief and what losing somebody does to you and all the different ways you can react to that. The Knights of the Borrowed Dark, the more they use the magic, the more it turns them to iron, because risking yourself for other people, as they do when they face my monsters, the Tenebris, or putting yourself in harm's way, or just standing up for what is right, hurts. Like, it might be the right thing to do, but that doesn't negate the fact that it is dangerous and it takes a toll, and the toll doesn't get less the more you do it. It gets more difficult. And I wanted to reflect that. Like, magic is so often treated as magic, as a quick fix or as point and click. And I wanted this magic to be just another way you could put yourself at risk for people, because that is the right thing to do. And yes, so much of the books, I feel I never set out to write kind of teenage themes, I guess, even though like the themes for a teenager are the same for themes for an adult. Loss and worry and wanting the people that you love to be safe. I think the only thing I did to make sure it was okay for 12-year-olds was you can't swear, basically. And Denizen doesn't have it. He starts to there's a love interest in the books, although she's an awful lot more complicated than that. But it's a very slow sort of thing, because I was a shy kid, and there's no like when you're writing upper end YA, you can have sex, and you can have drugs, and you can have alcohol and things like that. Denizen is 13. He is terrified of all of that nonsense. So yeah, they're so in that regard, but the peril is dialed up to 90, because that's what's interesting to me.
These books, and there are two published so far, Night of the Borrowed Dark and Knights of the Borrowed Dark, the Forever Court series. And these are like 400 pages long. And is that a typical length for this age reader, or are these getting kind of into Harry Potter territory? In that, the books that, and what I mean that as a compliment, that, Harry Potter really challenged what a lot of people thought about readers of that age. And, initially it was like, these kids are not going to read a book that thick. And then, by the time the series is over, there's 700 pages and they're not long enough. What kind of feedback are you getting from readers, or maybe from educators or parents that are buying the books? Are you getting some of that these books are really capturing these readers' imagination and pulling them in?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting. There is no greater feeling than when a kid comes up to you with a book that has obviously been read to pieces, like it's falling apart. I had a kid. I did my first event out of the country. I did an event at a festival in Wales, and I didn't think anyone would be there because I don't know anybody in Wales, and it's far from my mother to travel. So I didn't think there'd be anyone there, and we had to move the event to a bigger room because there were that many people there. And this tiny moppet kid walks up to me, and he's got this book, and he's like, "I really like your book." And I was like, "Clearly you've been chewing on it." Like it was just falling apart, and I was delighted. It's such a wonderful feeling, because Denizen, my main character, he is not an easy person to like. He's worried all the time. He is constantly second guesses, and he has a core of anger in him. The anger of someone who's always to the left of what's right and always to the left of what's going on, and is someone who has never settled with themselves. And it's so gratifying to find out that there are people like that, and these people are kids, and I went through the same thing that I went through. I mean, the first book is 76,000 words long, which is long-ish for upper middle grade, which is a phrase I'm not mad on, because we don't have grades in Ireland, and people don't really know what it means. I met, I won't say who it was, but I met a fairly famous writer at a party once, and she was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was like, "Oh, I write middle grade fiction." And she was like, "Don't be so hard on yourself." I was like, that's not what it means. Thanks. Like, how dare you?
Oh my gosh.
I'm getting really, really interesting feedback from them. So book 2 is darker again in that it introduces human villains, and they're basically a cross between the Malfoys and the Westboro Baptist Church, because I like dissecting the things that we often see in middle grade and YA, and one of those things is the chosen one. Like, you would, if you were a chosen one, if you were told that destiny and prophecy made you special, can I swear?
Sure.
You would be an asshole.
Right.
You'd be an awful person. Like, that kind of certainty. And there's no prophecies, and there's no sure things in my book or anything like that. But there are a group of people who believe they have the same powers as the knights, but they believe that it's destiny, and they believe that they are chosen, and they have a giant woman made of barbed wire in their basement, and they think she's God, and she's not. And that's a dark concept. But kids, I find that, like, younger kids or kids who are reading it on a more super casual level enjoy the fights, and they enjoy the monsters, and they enjoy the peril. And then more and more, I've been getting these kids come up and say, I really like, and they don't look at me, they look at the floor and they go, I really like what you do with Dennis and Dennis' anxiety. Or they'll ask a really sharp question about one of the things in the book, like one of the more the knights use their power, the more they turn to iron, because they wear the cost of bravery on their skin. And I've had kids talk to me about, you know, they come up after I do a lot of events, and I offer a free signed copy of the book for the best question, because it gets competitive kids and nervous kids out of their shell. And I've had kids stay a little bit afterwards and ask me, you know, do they turn to iron more because things get hard and it's hard to feel things and you get more distant? And I'm like, yes. And other kids ask, is it a reference to depression? And I say, if that's what you get out of it, then yes, if that works for you. And I never like telling kids. I tell kids sometimes what I mean when I write the books, but I much rather, it's like pronunciation. If a kid comes up and says, how do you pronounce this character's name? I say, well, how do you pronounce it? And they say, like this. And I go, cool, that's it. That's fine. Like, it's such, I don't know, I feel writing for young people, it's like being given a really fragile thing to hold, and you have to take so seriously how you do it. And maybe that's the teaching background or whatever, but like, you really get a chance to make kids' day when they ask you questions. And like, so many kids go, do you ever feel like giving up? It's like, all the time, but I don't. And you're not allowed to either, because then I don't get to read your book. And you'd see them go, okay, cool. And then you get the kids who put up their hand and go, I have a question. What's your favorite number? It's like 7. Good night.
Oh, I love it. I love it. There is a third book in the works also, isn't there?
Yes. So Knights of the Borrowed Dark and the Forever Court are currently out, both in Ireland, the UK, and in the States. And The Endless King, which is the final book in the trilogy, is going to be out next year. So each book for me symbolizes a different thing. Like, book 1 is very personal, book 2 is very dark and sort of complicated, and book 3, I just go epic. I just go big. I have no idea how they're going to like make it into film or whatever, because it's just ludicrously large and stuff. That's the great thing about writing. There's no budget. It's great. But
yeah. So I'm assuming book 3 is finished, at least drafted and in editing and all of that good process.
Yeah, all the commas have been tweaked, and they've taken out all the semicolons, because I have no idea what they do, and I keep using them anyway. They just look nice.
Nobody else does either. Just, you feel obligated when you're writing 76,000 words. It feels like you ought to have at least 5 in there.
Yeah, a couple of gerunds. Kind of thing.
Just sprinkle them about, just, so Dave, you've spent, quite a while in this world with these characters, and you finished out this trilogy. First off, what does it feel like to have brought, this story, to this end? But then, do you immediately start thinking about what's next? As a writer, do you feel obligated to, pick up the next idea and start running with it?
It's a really interesting feeling finishing a trilogy, because from a writing point of view, I always think writing a novel is you set up laboriously all these narrative debts, and then in the last third, pay them off, and you don't have anything in the book that doesn't have some kind of payoff. But when you start a third book, you already have all these narrative debts. I find it quite challenging because part of me just wanted to skip to the end. I was like, I know how they all comes down to one line, and I know what that one line is, and I want to get there. And it felt weird setting up all these new things and bringing in new characters when I already knew how the last 30,000 words of the book were going to look. But it's a really lovely, and it was always intended to be a trilogy, so it felt very good bringing it to the end. I think The World of the Knights, I'm really, really fond of it, and I did put a couple of little things in there that could be used to do a spin-off or a different series with different characters. But yeah, it ends. The trilogy ends. So I was supposed to take some time off. I immediately wrote the first chapter of a new novel because I'm bad at relaxing. I have two ideas. I have a YA idea and a middle grade idea, both in brand new worlds, both focusing on very different things about fantasy that I want to dissect and explore. And sort of, in a way, I think we're all always writing fan fiction. There are no brand new stories, but there's just your take on familiar things. And I think when you know the expectation that the reader has, you can trick them and you can mess with them and still speak their language, but show them a brand new dialect. And so I have two new ideas that go in very different directions, and we'll see how, basically. So.
If people have liked what they've heard about you and your stories and want to follow along with everything that's going on with you, where can they find you online?
So they can find me at daverudden.com. I'm also on Twitter at D_Rudden Writes. I'm on Instagram at the Rud Less Travelled because I love puns. I also do school visits over Skype or in person. So if people can find all those details on my website, and you can get Knights of the Bar Dark and the Forever Court in any bookshop or order it. So yeah, I hope you like it.
Excellent. Dave, do you think we'll see Knights of the Borrowed Dark up on the big screen?
Well, just between me and you and everybody listening, we have the director of Zombieland has taken it on as a project, and yeah, which is great because I really like Zombieland. There's always that nervousness that they're going to come in and go, oh, it's like, you know, the guy who directed Space Jam, and I'm like, I love Space Jam, but I'm like, I don't know if it's right for Knights of the Bar Dark. Not feel really bad if they're listening. I apologize. So that the other that we're working on at the minute is there's going to be a spin-off anime. Which I'm going to be writing, which is super. I'm very, very excited about it. I'm a big fan of the medium more so than genre, and it lends itself to really, really terrifying monsters and really vivid emotion and vivid storytelling. Two things that I really, really love. So yes, that's been done with Crunchyroll, the anime streaming company. So yeah, it should be. There'll be more details on the site on my site when we're further along with that.
Nice. Well, we will send everyone over to your website to follow along. Dave, it has been so much fun hanging out with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
This has been really, really lovely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Natalie? It's Artie. Listen, I'm going to be late for dinner. I ran out of gas on... He climbed out of the car and peered at the sign. On Sleepy Hollow Road. There's nothing but trees, and I have to find a gas station. Save me a drumstick. He hung up his cell and stuck it in his pocket, zipping his jacket. He was going to have to walk and pray somebody picked him up. A sliver of crescent moon hung above, surrounded by clouds, like a grinning drunk asleep in a puddle. Artie walked, using his tablet as a flashlight, eyes on the gravel ahead. He crossed over a dark ravine. The trunks and overhanging branches were matted thick with wild grapevines and threw a cavernous gloom over the road. A figure stood at a crossroads ahead. It looked pale and wan and blue. A woman? He had an impression of fragility and age, and thought of his warty old landlady. But his landlady would not be standing at a crossroads in the dark. "Excuse me?" Artie said, surprised by the fear in his own voice. "Do you know where I can find a gas station? I'm empty." "Then let me fill you," the figure whispered. It rushed at him. It entered him. He dropped the tablet, fell to his knees, and lost his body to another driver. When Artie woke again, he was dangling in midair. The woods were pitch black. The only lights were fireflies. Fireflies everywhere, like dancing stars. He struggled and cried out, his yellow sneakers trying to find the ground. "Shh," said a voice. "It will all be over soon." Panic rose. He felt invisible hands on his legs, on his arms, invisible fingers around his neck, reaching up the back of his shirt. He heard the sound of water running below, high and agitated, as if through a stony brook. The crescent moon swung out of the sky, falling into the water. Blood rushed into his cheeks. He realized he had been flipped upside down. He yelled and groped, flecking his own face with spit, helpless to drive away whatever was attacking him. He felt a sharp pain between his shoulder blades, and air flew out of his lungs. A spray of blood hit his cheeks, hot and clinging. His hands found a sharp branch protruding from his body. It had speared him through his back and out through his chest. He tried to say help, but had no air to form the word. Blood poured up his body. No, it poured down. It only felt as if it were rising, climbing his neck, covering his face, gathering in his scalp. He reached for the ribbon of blood that fell from his crown into the trickle of moonlight below. The ribbon slipped through his fingers. It thinned, choked, became a tiny rivulet. His tanks were empty. Not even fumes. His engine began to sputter. The flow became a drip. A maddening drip like the drip, drip, drip of his kitchen faucet. The drip his landlady hadn't fixed. The drip that kept him up at night. This drip would not be keeping him up. He would sleep very well this night. Very well indeed. The fireflies slipped into shadow. A figure appeared, blue as gaslight, bony and toothless. A crone from a fairy tale. "Thank you, my friends," she whispered. "I am thankful for this good harvest." She neared, scrutinized him with manic intensity, and turned away, muttering to herself in a sing-song rhythm as she, too, vanished into the trees. "A man may toil from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done,"